ask if anybody has a question, please put your hand up. I think there's some microphones floating around. Please state your name and your affiliation and to whom you would like the question directed.
Julian Chen from Henning Larsen Architects in Denmark. My question is to James. I think you've shown us very good examples of using tall buildings as a mechanism to secure the physical space for the public realm. But I wonder whether tall buildings could be used beyond that, as in whether there's potential for the tall buildings to add quality, to influence the quality of the public realm. For example, by enhancing the microclimate using the massing of the tall building, or perhaps, for example, by the program inside the tall building, the tenants, what's inside the tall building might have a direct influence on the quality of the public realm.
No, thanks for your question. That's a great question. I mean, obviously, design is important, and that's something that Craig just left with. So we have to think about, first of all, the design of those spaces to improve the microclimate. So landscaping, wind protection, and we in Toronto have tall building guidelines, and that actually asks for step backs above a podium height. So in terms of the wind effects, we all know the downwash from a tall building can be a problem. So we have to try to mitigate that with built form. So moves to the built form to move the tower elements away from the public realm. And then, of course, very much, programming is important. You don't want to have dead spaces. You don't want to put your storage or your bicycle storage adjacent to these open spaces. You need to have them lined with retail. You need to design that retail right, minimum heights, lots of glass, for example, or lobbies, or as a last resort, the amenity space for these buildings. But that's something that really is important to creating to the success of the space. It's not just the space, but everything has to work together to create a successful open space.
My name is Jake Pauls. I've lived in a few of the cities in Canada which were featured in the talk. I have a yes/no question for Greg, and then I have a more difficult question for the whole panel. Quick question for Greg: is the High Line accessible to people who can't use stairs?
Yes.
Thank you. The tougher question is, and I'm a Canadian and U.S. citizen. I've lived in both countries. I live in a city, or near a city, which will never be a subject of this conference, which is Washington, D.C. But I'm curious. I appreciate that Canadian cities appear out of proportion in this presentation, and the question is why. I'm a Canadian, I know some of the answers, but I'd like to hear your response. Why is it that Canada does a better job within this context of the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat with urban habitat compared with U.S. cities?
James, you should probably answer that.
Yeah, no, I certainly don't agree with that. I think we all do really great work, and we learn from each other. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we struck this Urban Habitat Committee. Actually, that was headed by Anthony and David Malott, the current chairman, to think about how you can promote this aspect of urban design and urban habitat more. So the idea of learning from all of these other places is really important. Believe me, there's a long list of things that I have to see when I'm here in New York that I want to learn from, including the High Line and One World Trade Center in terms of public realm. But at the same time, we're hosting a chapter tour on Thursday and Friday to Toronto, and there's been great interest in that as well because of the things that we're doing. So I think that what we can do to promote better urban design is something that I think will help promote the aspect of cities and the quality of life that we have in cities, which ultimately is an important thing. I mean, that's a big, broader issue, right, in terms of our growth and why we need to grow tall. That's a question that comes up over and over again. But we want to grow tall, and we want to do it well so that we can enhance our quality of life.
If I could just add to that as well. The one thing which is probably apparent in the work that's been discussed over the past 10 years, Canada's been growing at a significantly higher proportionate rate than the US has been growing at the same rate as India. So I think that reflects in there's a lot of work being shown and a lot of development happening because of the rate of growth. But if your real question is Canada best, the answer is yes.
I would have to beg to differ, sorry.
Hey, my name is Terry Boken. I'm also from Canada. We're going to take over the world.
Oh, wow.
So, and you know, I would like to offer before I ask my own question, is just to offer that one of the absolute key ingredients to making lively downtown neighborhoods is not just the architecture, but it's the level of safety and people's sense of being safe in cities, and then they can be more active. And I think that one of the ways that is actually happening is with mixed-use developments. So as we bring more and more people living into downtown cores and using the streets and walking back and forth and doing their shopping on the way home. And actually, I did a poster, so you can see my poster out there. It's called, it's not about the skyline, it's about the base condition, that there's far too much preoccupation on the baubles at the top, and people aren't spending money on the bottom. And I think the fine grain we need at the bottom is what takes me to the question I have for Jersey City. I'm supposed to be taking notes on these presentations. You had way too much information, but that's a good thing. But what I wanted to pick up on was something that I thought would go really well with James's 1 to 50 requirement in terms of having the people who are submitting the drawings actually take ownership of something at a residential scale, instead of the usual thing with skyscrapers where they do these little tiny drawings and there's a facade and there's a sidewalk and there's no detail because the scale's too small. So I like 1 to 50 because it makes them see things at a scale where you have to put people in and you have to draw a plaza at 1 to 50, and if there's one bench in the middle and one dinky piece of public art and the rest is paving, you've got a problem. But how do you get an architect every feet to 50 feet? Because I think that's one of the things that is really potentially an amazing step forward and would solve the problems I still see happening in Toronto, James's work aside, is that you get a condo building and we have too many drugstores. There are shopping drug marts and Rexall Pharma Pluses and a bank, and you take a block that used to have 20 small 15-foot wide stores, and all of a sudden you've got 3 major occupancies, a couple of doors, a couple of blanked off walls, and a dead block. So how would the two of you work to get this sort of every 50 feet you need somebody different designing and get that residential scale working? Because I think that would make for safer streets because you'd have people using them.
2 things. We actually put it in the code. It was suggested by Dewani that it should be every 100 feet. And the developer who hired Dewani said, that's a good idea. I'll do it every 50 feet. So he volunteered to do it. We do require on any tall building over so many stories that the ground floors have detail sheets so we know exactly what the ground floor will look like. So it's a large scale. I'm not sure if it's 150 or what it is, but we do require blow-ups basically of the floors. And then we just recently adopted legislation that limits formula-based businesses to no more than 30% of the retail space within buildings in certain redevelopment areas downtown to sort of encourage the mom and pops. I mean, other than some of the resort towns like Nantucket, I think it's just San Francisco and Jersey City that have done that. It's pretty radical. Our mayor wanted to do it, and we did it, and we didn't get sued. So it's law.
Good, that's fantastic.
So on certain streets, we write urban design guidelines for them. And in many places, the banks are popular and the drugstores are popular, but in certain streets that have a character, we want to make sure that we extend and expand upon that character through urban design. So we would mandate, for example, minimum size storefronts on the ground floor. We wouldn't preclude a larger storefront going in on the second floor that you would access from the ground floor, but at least your experience on the ground floor is those mom and pop shops, so you can get some variety in the public realm.
We have a question on the front. I know you've been waiting since the beginning, and then David at the back.
Rafael Gomez, Farmacetti and CTBUH representative in Brazil, São Paulo. I had a question for Craig. A while ago, I heard about a project called the Low Line, which was an underground park. I don't know if that ever took off, but I wanted to hear your take on underground parks, or if you've ever seen such a development happen. And I'm actually staying by 8th and 14th, and so I'm at the very beginning of the High Line, and it's just very bright, vibrant. I got to go there on Saturday, and all the Halloween decorations and activities. It's just a great place.
Yeah, I do. In fact, I walked the low line very recently. It's a proposal on the Lower East Side. It's an underutilized piece of the MTA infrastructure. It's where trolleys used to turn around from the Williamsburg Bridge underground. So it's about 60, 70,000 square foot of open space. We're talking to some of the developers on that. It's interesting. It's much different than the High Line, even though they sort of, there's a play on the name. Where I think is interesting in that area is the Seward Park development and understanding the Seward Park development. Again, for New York, this is a very big deal for that area of the city in terms of the new residential development going in, and also office and retail development going into a place in New York that really hasn't seen much construction in many, many years. But I mean, that area, what's really key to the potential success of something like the Low Line is really engaging that public-private partnership in that development cycle. And I think, I'm not quite sure that it certainly won't have the same success as the High Line, because I think that's off the charts, but I do think that there's a model for replicability there. It's not just putting in a nice park, it's having that type of public-private partnership in connection with the development to really, the two to feed off of one another. So we'll see. We'll see.
Is the planting mostly mushrooms in the low line?
Yeah, well, they have actually an interesting light technology, being light down there, but a little too much for this.
All right, thanks. David, out the back.
Yeah, David Malott, CTBUH Chair and Jersey City resident. So first, thank you to Bob. Go Jersey, right? Thank you to Bob. Fantastic job. And then a question for Bob. You showed a picture of the flooding in Jersey City. So you mentioned the vulnerability, particularly post-Sandy. Are you planning to do anything? And if you were to do, what would be the kind of policy or zoning mechanisms or funding mechanisms that would be available to you to enable something of that scale?
We produced a couple of plans. One was essentially looking at the elevation of 14, which is the new build to elevation to protect for the next who knows how many decades, certainly not centuries. So we sort of connected the dots because, as I pointed out, the waterfront is pretty much all filled land, but there were a couple of small hills on the low-lying land. So the project that we had funding for was to do a visualization analysis, basically, of what it would look like if we built such structures like raising Washington Street to that elevation from its current elevation of about 10 with 4 extra feet. In some cases, it would be 7 extra feet, what that would look like and how would you manage that. The visualizations showed that it's pretty radical stuff. Doing that is building a sort of wall around the city is going to be tough. There were areas where we were able to do it with a berm, which is much better looking. And then some areas that are still yet to be developed, like Liberty Harbor North, we just filled. So we raised the streets, the sites, everything gets filled and raised out of the floodplain. On the back end of the city, on the west side, there we looked at the highway, the Route 440, which I didn't talk about in my presentation, but there's a plan to turn that back highway into a boulevard to service the new development coming to the west side and raise that up to become a flood barrier. And then everything that gets built going forward would be and 15, 16, 17 feet above sea level. And then there's the waterfront walkway that we also showed on the west side. I didn't show images of it, but the other would be that needs to be rebuilt. It should be rebuilt with fill and take it up to 14 feet so it becomes an amenity as well as a flood protection device. Unfortunately, there's no money to pay for any of this, but we did at least take the time to take how do we do it, what would it look like, and then we brought that to the community, and we received pretty good responses.